The night was still, the air thick with silence. A lone car hummed along a deserted road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The vehicle slowed as an obstacle came into view, a crude blockade of wooden planks and scattered debris. The driver, an older man with a calm yet intense demeanor, sighed before stepping out. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. He was no stranger to situations like this. Diego Velasco had spent years seeking peace, distancing himself from the shadows that once defined him. A retired man in his 60s, he lived a quiet life in a small town, tending to simple routines. No one who met him would suspect his past, a past steeped in precision, lethality, and blood. He had walked away from that world, believing it was behind him. But danger has a way of finding men like Diego. From the darkness, a group of figures emerged. Local traffickers, young and cocky, unaware of who they were provoking. Their leader, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, grinned. "Looks like you took a wrong turn, old man," he sneered. Diego's sharp eyes assessed the group, noting their careless stance, their overconfidence. He had seen this kind of arrogance before, men who mistook age for weakness. He inhaled slowly. He had no desire for violence, but violence had a way of following him. This night the past would come knocking once more. Will Diego be able to protect his new life? Or will the darkness pull him back in? Subscribe to witness the return of a man who thought he had left it all behind. The road stretched endlessly under the dim glow of the moon, its cracked asphalt whispering tales of neglect. Diego Velasco drove at a steady pace, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, his mind calm. The night wrapped around him like an old companion, quiet and undemanding. He had grown to appreciate silence in his later years. Then he saw it. A crude blockade, wooden planks, rusted barrels, and scattered debris stood in the middle of the road. Diego exhaled through his nose, a slow, measured breath. He gently pressed the brakes, easing the car to a stop. The engine idled for a few moments before he turned the key, cutting the sound entirely. The night remained still, but something had shifted. Diego opened the door and stepped out. The cool air carried the scent of earth and distant smoke. He adjusted his jacket, his movements neither hurried nor hesitant. He was aware of the eyes watching him, the figures lurking just beyond the edges of the dim light. Then they appeared. 5 men emerged from the shadows, their steps casual but purposeful. The leader, a wiry man with a scar down his cheek, wore a smirk that held more arrogance than caution. "You lost, viejo?" the man asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Diego's gaze swept over them, taking in the details. The nervous grip one had on his belt, the poorly concealed knives, the casual stance of men who had never faced a real threat. "I'm just passing through," Diego replied, his voice calm. The scarred man chuckled, glancing at his companions. "Bad luck, old man, this road's got a toll." Diego tilted his head slightly. "That so?" A younger member of the group, barely more than a boy, shifted impatiently. "Just take his keys and get it over with," he muttered. Diego sighed. He had hoped to avoid this. The leader took a step closer. "Look, abuelo, don't make this difficult. Hand over your wallet, your keys, and maybe we let you go without a scratch." Diego's fingers twitched slightly, a subtle movement, imperceptible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice still even. The scarred man's smirk faltered, if only for a second. Something in Diego's tone, in his stillness, set off a quiet warning in the back of his mind. But pride was a dangerous thing. "Oh, I do," the man said, reaching for Diego's pocket. That was his mistake. Diego moved. A single step, smooth as flowing water. His hand caught the man's wrist, twisting it sharply. A cry of pain echoed in the night as the leader staggered back, clutching his arm. The others reacted sluggishly. The boy reached for a knife at his waist, but Diego was already in motion. A swift strike to the throat sent him gasping for air, his body crumpling to the ground. The third man lunged, but Diego sidestepped with effortless grace. A well-placed elbow to the ribs sent him sprawling, groaning. The last two hesitated, their bravado shattered. "Leave," Diego said quietly. They didn't need to be told twice. The moment they turned and fled into the darkness, their fallen leader and the boy scrambled after them, wheezing and cursing. Diego stood still, the night settling around him once more. His breathing remained steady. He had not broken a sweat. The roadblock remained. He took a moment to push aside the barrels, clear the planks. Then, without a glance back, he climbed into his car and restarted the engine. As he drove away, his reflection in the rearview mirror was unreadable. The past was closer than he had thought. The drive home was quiet, but Diego's mind was not. He had hoped the past was truly behind him, buried beneath years of solitude. Tonight had proven otherwise. The town of San Rios was small, the kind of place where people kept to themselves. Diego had chosen it precisely for that reason. His house, a modest structure on the outskirts, was surrounded by trees, away from prying eyes. He parked the car, stepped out, and inhaled deeply. The night was cool, still, but something lingered in the air, an unease that hadn't been there before. Diego pushed the thought aside and entered his home. He locked the door, not out of fear, but out of habit. Years of discipline were hard to shake. He prepared a cup of black coffee, sipping it slowly as he stood by the window. The stars above were unbothered by the events of the night. Diego exhaled, his fingers tapping against the ceramic mug. He didn't regret his actions, but he knew men like those wouldn't let humiliation go unanswered. And he was right. By midday, the rumors had spread. San Rios had its secrets, but whispers traveled fast. A lone old man had sent 5 armed thugs running into the night. The story had reached the wrong ears. Diego sensed it before he saw them. 2 black SUVs rolled into town, their tinted windows reflecting the harsh afternoon sun. They stopped in front of a bar, a local gathering spot for those who operated in the shadows. Men stepped out, their movements sharp, disciplined, not like the amateurs from the night before. Then he emerged. Ramon the Wolf stepped onto the dirt road with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who had never feared anything. His presence alone was enough to silence the street. Conversations died, and people averted their gazes. Diego watched from a distance, unseen. Ramon was taller than he remembered, broader. The years had sharpened him. A cruel smile played on his lips as he adjusted the cuffs of his crisp white shirt. A heavy silver ring gleamed on his hand, the symbol of his authority. The leader of the cartel had come in person. Inside the bar, the 5 men from last night stood before him, heads bowed. The scarred one, the leader, stammered an explanation. Ramon listened, his expression unreadable. Then, with a single movement, he struck. The back of his hand landed across the scarred man's face with a crack. Blood splattered onto the wooden floor. The others stiffened but did not move. "You lost to a single man?" Ramon's voice was soft, almost amused. The man nodded, still clutching his cheek. Ramon exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Tell me about him." He's old. Just some nobody," the scarred man stammered. "But he moved like—" Ramon's eyes flickered with recognition before narrowing. "Like what?" A beat of silence. Then, realization dawned. "Like him?" Nobody spoke. The scarred man swallowed hard. Ramon's smile returned, but colder now. "Diego Velasco," he murmured, the name rolling off his tongue like an old memory. The room remained still. Even those who didn't know the name could feel its weight. Ramon chuckled, his amusement growing. "The legend himself," he said, shaking his head. "And here I thought he was dead." A pause. Then, the amusement faded. "He took something from me once," Ramon said, voice turning sharp. "I won't allow him to take anything again." He turned to his men. "Find him. Bring him to me." The order was final. Outside, Diego stepped away from his vantage point, his jaw tightening. Ramon had found him. The past had finally caught up. Diego sat in his modest home, staring at the steaming cup of coffee on the table before him. The aroma filled the air, but he didn't reach for it. His thoughts were elsewhere, years away in a life he had tried to bury. Ramon had found him. He had known it was only a matter of time before someone from his past came looking. A man like Diego couldn't simply disappear. Too many people had wanted him dead. Too many had feared him. Now he had a choice: run or fight. A knock at the door shattered his thoughts. He remained still, listening. The knock came again, calm, measured, not the reckless pounding of a thug sent to break him. Diego exhaled softly and stood. He opened the door to find a man he hadn't seen in over 2 decades, Mateo Valera, an old ally, once a brother in arms. His hair was now peppered with gray, his face lined with the weight of years, but his eyes remained sharp, carrying the same quiet intensity that had once made him one of the deadliest men Diego had ever known. "Long time," Mateo said. Diego didn't respond immediately. He stepped aside, allowing Mateo in. The door closed, sealing them off from the world outside. Mateo looked around the small house, nodding to himself. Didn't think I'd ever see you living like this. Diego sat back down. Neither did I. Mateo remained standing. Ramon is looking for you. I know. He won't stop. I know that too. Silence settled between them. Finally, Diego gestured to the empty chair. Sit. Mateo hesitated, then did as he was told. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You're a ghost, Diego. People speak your name in whispers. Some still think you're a myth. He smirked slightly. But Ramon, he knows better. He remembers. Diego nodded slowly. And now he wants me dead. Mateo's smirk faded. He doesn't just want you dead. He wants to erase you. Diego studied his old friend. And you? Why are you here? Mateo exhaled. Because I know what's coming. He leaned closer. Ramon has men everywhere. He won't send amateurs next time. He'll come himself if he has to. Diego remained quiet. Mateo frowned. So? What's the plan? Diego finally took a sip of his coffee, savoring it before responding. I'm not running. Mateo chuckled dryly. Didn't think you would. He shook his head. But I need to know, are you still that man? Or have the years softened you? Diego met his gaze unflinching. Try me. Mateo held the stare for a moment, then grinned. There's the bastard I remember. Before Diego could respond, a sharp sound outside caught their attention. Footsteps, several. Diego set his cup down. His hand moved instinctively to the knife on the table. Old habits never faded. Mateo pulled a pistol from inside his jacket. Checking the magazine with practiced ease, a shadow passed by the window. Then, the door burst open. 5 men stormed in, their weapons drawn. Diego moved first. A twist of the wrist, a flash of steel. His knife found its target in the throat of the first attacker before he could fire. Blood sprayed across the wall as he crumpled. Mateo fired twice, dropping another. The remaining 3 hesitated, thrown off by the sudden, brutal efficiency of the counterattack. That hesitation cost them. Diego surged forward, disarming the 3rd man in a fluid motion. A sharp strike to the temple sent him to the ground, unconscious. The 4th tried to retreat, but Mateo's bullet found his knee, sending him howling in pain. The last man, a younger one, wide-eyed with terror, froze. He realized too late that he had been sent after someone far beyond his skill. Diego stepped toward him. Go back to Ramon. The man nodded frantically, stumbling over himself as he ran. Silence returned, heavy with the scent of blood and gunpowder. Mateo exhaled, lowering his gun. Well, he said, shaking his head. Guess you haven't softened after all. Diego didn't respond. He simply retrieved his knife, wiped the blood from the blade, and placed it back on the table. The message had been sent. Ramon would know, and this was far from over. Diego stood at the threshold of his home, staring into the night. The bodies had been dealt with, dragged into the forest, their presence erased. Only the bloodstains on the wooden floor remained, a silent reminder that peace was never truly his to keep. Mateo sat at the table, reloading his pistol with methodical ease. They'll send more, he said without looking up. Diego knew that. Word would reach Ramon by sunrise. The young man they had let go would carry the warning back, but it wouldn't stop the inevitable. If anything, it would provoke Ramon further. Diego ran a hand down his face. He had chosen this life of solitude to escape precisely this kind of violence, but violence had found him anyway. Mateo leaned back, studying him. You thinking of running? Diego shook his head. No. Good. Mateo smirked. I'd hate to think the great Diego Velasco finally got tired of the fight. Diego sighed. I never wanted the fight. Mateo tilted his head. Maybe, but it's in you. Always has been. He gestured to the blood on the floor. Men like us, we don't get to walk away clean. Silence stretched between them. Outside, the town of San Rios remained oblivious, its people sleeping peacefully. They had no idea of the war brewing just beyond their quiet streets. And that was the problem. Diego had carved a new life here, a simple one. The baker who greeted him in the morning, the old couple who waved as he passed, the boy who occasionally helped him carry groceries, they were all part of a world he had grown to care about. Ramon wouldn't just come for him, he would come for everything. Diego exhaled sharply, turning to Mateo. I can't let this spill into the town. Mateo's expression turned serious. Then you need to end it before it begins. Diego nodded. The choice had been made. He would not run, but he would not wait either. He would go to them. By morning, the town was buzzing. People whispered about the SUVs that had rolled in the day before, about the men who had asked questions and left before dawn. Diego moved through the marketplace as if nothing had changed, nodding politely to the vendors, greeting familiar faces, but his mind was already elsewhere. He wasn't the only one who noticed the shift. Something wrong, Diego? He turned to see Rosa, the woman who ran the small grocery store at the edge of town. She had known him for years, always offering fresh produce and warm smiles. Diego forced a small smile. Just a long night. She frowned, glancing around. There are strangers asking about you. Diego nodded. I know. Her eyes searched his face. Are you in trouble? He hesitated, then shook his head. Nothing I can't handle. Rosa didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. Just be careful, Diego. He nodded once before walking away. The town was beginning to sense the storm coming, and Diego knew he had little time left before it arrived. That night, he sat at his table once more. Mateo was gone, scouting ahead, gathering information. Diego cleaned his pistol, checked his knives. The weight of his past sat heavy on his shoulders. This was not the life he had wanted, but it was the life he had earned. And now he would protect it, no matter the cost. The town of San Rios was no stranger to trouble. Over the years, gangs had come and gone, but none had taken root, until Ramon, the wolf, set his sights on it. His men had begun to appear more frequently, lurking on street corners, watching, waiting. The town felt it, the creeping tension that settled in like an unwelcome guest. Diego saw it too, and he knew the time for waiting was over, but he would not fight alone. Mateo returned just before dawn, his boots silent against the wooden floor as he stepped into Diego's home. He tossed a cigarette onto the table, unlit, then pulled up a chair. They're setting up at an old warehouse on the east side, Mateo said. Looks like they're waiting for Ramon's final word. Diego nodded. He had expected as much. How many? At least a dozen for now. More will come if we let them get comfortable. Diego took a slow breath. 12 men. That was manageable. But the real fight wouldn't be against the foot soldiers. It was against the man pulling the strings. Mateo smirked. You thinking of charging in alone? Diego glanced at him. No. Mateo leaned back. Good. Because you've got people watching your back. Diego frowned slightly. People? Mateo's smirk widened. Turns out you made an impression in this town. That afternoon, Diego met them. A small group gathered behind Rosa's grocery store. Faces he recognized from the marketplace, the mechanics, the fishermen, even the younger men who worked odd jobs. They weren't trained fighters, but they were locals, and they were tired of being afraid. Rosa stood among them, arms crossed. We're not going to let them take our town. Diego looked at them, considering. This isn't your fight. A burly mechanic named Gabriel stepped forward. It is now. You don't understand what Ramon is capable of, Diego warned. Gabriel scoffed. Maybe not. But we know what you're capable of. Diego narrowed his eyes. And what do you think that is? Rosa met his gaze. We know you're not just some old man. Diego exhaled. His past had been guessed at, but not fully uncovered. And yet, these people stood before him, willing to fight alongside him. You realize if we do this, Diego said, there's no turning back. Gabriel cracked his knuckles. Then we'd better do it right. Diego studied them. They weren't soldiers, but they were willing. And sometimes that was enough. He looked at Mateo. We'll need weapons. Mateo grinned. Already working on it. By nightfall, the town was preparing. Diego and Mateo moved through back alleys, arming those who would stand with them. Not everyone had guns, but knives, bats, and makeshift weapons were passed between hands. The locals were determined. Standing at the edge of the town square, Diego watched the preparations unfold. He felt something unfamiliar stir within him. He had spent his life as a weapon, a tool of destruction. Now, for the first time, he was fighting for something. Not to kill, but to protect. Mateo clapped him on the shoulder. Didn't think you'd be leading an army, huh? Diego allowed the ghost of a smile. It's not an army. Mateo laughed. It will be by the time we're done. Diego's smile faded. Ramon won't take this lightly. Mateo's expression darkened. No, he won't. They stood in silence, the weight of the coming storm heavy between them. And then, without warning, the night was shattered by the crack of gunfire. An explosion rocked the edge of town, sending a plume of smoke into the sky. The first strike had come. Ramon had made his move, and the battle for San Rios had begun. The explosion rattled the town, sending a shockwave through the quiet streets. Smoke billowed from the warehouse district, and distant shouts filled the air. Diego's jaw tightened. Ramon wasn't waiting, he had made his first move. Mateo pulled his pistol. "They're trying to send a message." Diego nodded. "Then let's answer." They moved quickly, cutting through the alleys toward the source of the blast. Others followed: Gabriel, Rosa, a handful of armed locals. The town was no longer silent. People were waking up, staring at the rising smoke with fear and confusion. As they reached the outskirts, Diego's eyes swept over the burning remains of an old storage facility. A few of Ramon's men stood near the fire, their weapons raised, scanning the area. Diego motioned for silence. He counted 6 of them. Small numbers, a warning, not a full attack. Ramon was testing them. But then Diego noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the men standing with them was familiar. Luis, a young man from San Rios, someone who had eaten at Rosa's store, laughed with Gabriel, walked these streets his whole life. But now he stood beside Ramon's soldiers, gripping a rifle, his face filled with nervous energy. Betrayal. Rosa cursed under her breath. Gabriel's fists clenched. Diego, however, remained still. His gaze never left Luis. He needed to know why. He stepped forward. The others tensed, but Diego didn't hesitate. "Luis." His voice carried through the night, calm but firm. Luis jerked at the sound of his name. His grip on the rifle tightened, but he didn't raise it. "Diego, you shouldn't be here." Diego took another step. "Neither should you." One of Ramon's men nudged Luis. "What are you doing? Shoot him." Luis swallowed hard. His eyes flickered with hesitation. He wasn't a killer. Not yet. "Why?" "Luis?" Diego asked. Luis hesitated, his eyes darting to the others. He looked young, too young. He took a breath. "They offered protection. They said if we fought back, they'd burn the whole town down." Diego studied him. "And you believed them?" Luis hesitated again. His silence was an answer. One of the other men raised his weapon. "Enough talking." The gunshot cracked through the night. Diego had already moved. A step to the side, a quick draw, a single, precise shot. The man with the gun dropped, his weapon clattering to the ground. Chaos erupted. Mateo fired next, taking down another. Gabriel charged forward with a roar, tackling one of the men to the ground. Rosa and the others spread out, using the darkness as cover. But Diego's focus remained on Luis. The boy's rifle was still in his hands, but he hadn't fired. He stood frozen, his eyes darting between Diego and the men falling around him. Then, as if waking from a trance, Luis dropped the gun. He ran. Diego let him go. The fight was over in seconds. The remaining men either fell or fled. The fire still burned behind them, but it no longer mattered. The first battle had been won, but the war was far from over. An hour later, Diego sat in his home, his fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The town had survived the first attack, but Ramon would come back stronger. And worse, Luis had betrayed them. Mateo leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "What are you thinking?" Diego exhaled. "Luis didn't do this because he wanted to." Mateo nodded. "Fear makes men weak." Diego set his cup down. "Ramon is playing a different game now. He's not just sending men, he's turning ours against us." Mateo sighed. "So what do we do?" Diego's gaze darkened. "We stop waiting. Tomorrow, they would take the fight to Ramon." Dawn broke over San Rios, casting a golden hue over the quiet town. But beneath the calm surface, the storm brewed. The people had seen the explosion, heard the gunfire. They knew war had come to their doorstep. Diego stood in Rosa's grocery store, which had now become an impromptu war room. The air was thick with tension as Mateo, Gabriel, and a handful of others gathered around a wooden table, studying the crude map of the town. "This is where they're based." Mateo pointed to the warehouse district where Ramon's men had taken control. "They're dug in, expecting us to wait." Diego nodded. "We won't." Gabriel crossed his arms. "You sure about this? They've got numbers, firepower." Diego met his gaze. "Which is why we have to be smarter." The room fell silent. Then Diego began laying out the plan. By midday, the pieces were in motion. The first step was cutting off Ramon's resources. His men relied on supply routes, food, weapons, communication. Diego's people began working in the shadows, sabotaging vehicles, blocking roads, intercepting messages. The second step was deception. Ramon expected a direct confrontation, but Diego had other plans. He spread misinformation, letting whispers reach Ramon's spies that his forces were fractured, that fear had begun to spread. The third step was the trap. That night, Diego and Mateo crouched on the rooftop of an abandoned building, overlooking the main road leading into the warehouse district. Below them, Ramon's men moved in and out of their base, unaware of the noose tightening around them. Diego adjusted his earpiece. "Everyone in position?" Rosa's voice crackled through. "We're set." Gabriel followed. "Ready when you are." Diego took a slow breath. "We wait for the signal." Inside the warehouse, Ramon paced, irritation etched on his face. The loss of his men the night before had angered him, but it was the silence afterward that truly unsettled him. Diego wasn't acting like a desperate man. He was acting like a hunter. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. One of his lieutenants entered, his expression uncertain. "Senor, we've lost contact with 2 more patrols." Ramon's jaw clenched, and then a distant explosion lit up the sky. The trap had sprung. Gunfire erupted from the south entrance as Gabriel and his men launched a sudden attack, drawing Ramon's forces out of the warehouse. Chaos took hold. As Ramon's men scrambled to respond, Diego and Mateo moved. Silent as shadows, they slipped inside the warehouse, navigating the maze of crates and steel beams. They weren't here to fight foot soldiers. They were here for Ramon. A guard turned a corner. Diego took him down with a swift strike, catching his rifle before it hit the ground. Mateo gestured ahead. "Main office." Diego nodded. The final confrontation was near, and this time there would be no escape. The chaos outside was growing. Gunfire echoed through the warehouse district, shouts filling the night as Diego's plan unfolded perfectly. Ramon's men were scattered, disoriented. They had expected an attack, but not like this. Diego and Mateo moved like phantoms through the corridors of the warehouse, bypassing unnecessary fights, conserving their strength for the real battle. The main office loomed ahead, a heavy metal door slightly ajar. Light spilled from within. Diego signaled Mateo to wait. He stepped forward, pressing himself against the wall before nudging the door open just enough to see inside. There, seated behind a desk with an air of complete control, was Ramon, the wolf. He was exactly as Diego remembered. Tall, broad, dressed in a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up, a heavy silver ring glinting on his right hand. Despite the chaos outside, he looked relaxed, almost amused, as if all of this had been inevitable, and across from him, bound to a chair, was Luis. The young man's face was bruised, his lips split. Fear shone in his eyes as Ramon casually swirled a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Your timing," Ramon said suddenly without turning, "is impressive, Diego." Mateo stiffened, readying his weapon, but Diego raised a hand, stepping inside. Ramon smiled and gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Sit." Diego didn't move. His eyes flicked to Luis, then back to Ramon. "Let him go." Ramon exhaled, setting down his glass. Diego, after all these years, you still act like you have control over how this ends." He leaned back. "Tell me something. Why didn't you kill the boy when you had the chance?" Luis flinched, looking at Diego in desperation. Diego's voice remained calm. "He's not my enemy," Ramon chuckled. "That's where we differ. I don't leave loose ends." He lifted a hand and a guard stepped forward, pressing a gun against Luis's temple. Diego's fingers twitched, but he forced himself to remain still. He had to wait. Ramon studied him, tilting his head slightly. "It's strange seeing you like this, living in some quiet little town, playing at being normal." His smile faded. "But we both know what you are, don't we?" Diego said nothing. Ramon nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision. "You took something from me once." The past surged forward like a wave. Memories Diego had spent years trying to bury. A mission, a betrayal, a bullet meant for Ramon that had taken someone else instead. "I spared you that night," Diego said evenly. Ramon's eyes darkened. "No, Diego, you didn't spare me. You cursed me." He gestured to the scar on his wrist, a mark from that night. From a blade Diego had driven deep, but not deep enough. "You should have finished the job," Ramon murmured. Silence hung between them. Then, Diego moved. A flick of his wrist, a hidden blade sliding into his palm. He threw it, the steel flashing through the dim light. The guard holding Luis barely had time to react before the blade buried itself in his throat. He staggered, choking, before collapsing to the floor. Luis toppled from the chair, gasping as the gun clattered away. Mateo fired twice, dropping another guard before stepping inside, covering Diego's flank. But Ramon didn't flinch. He simply smiled, standing slowly, unbuttoning his cuffs. "I was hoping for this," he murmured. And then he lunged. Diego met him head-on, their bodies colliding in a blur of motion. The desk overturned as they grappled, years of history erupting into raw violence. Ramon was strong, faster than Diego remembered, but Diego was precise, unyielding. Fists connected, bones cracked. Blood splattered across the floor. Mateo kept the remaining guards at bay, gunfire ringing through the room. Luis scrambled away, grabbing a discarded knife, his breath ragged as he watched the deadly dance before him. Ramon twisted, driving Diego into the wall. "You should have stayed buried," he growled. Diego gritted his teeth, wrenching free. "You should have left me alone." Then he struck. A sharp, precise jab, the knife Mateo had tossed him earlier, slammed into Ramon's ribs. Ramon gasped, stumbling back, eyes wide in shock. "You!" he exhaled, blood trickling from his lips. Diego watched as Ramon collapsed to his knees. The once feared wolf was now just a man breathing his last. Silence settled. The gunfire outside was dying down. Ramon's forces were scattering, leaderless. Luis stared, his hands trembling. Mateo exhaled, lowering his weapon. And Diego? He simply stood over Ramon's body, his past finally catching up to him. It was over, or so he thought. Ramon coughed, blood pooling at the corner of his lips. His body swayed as he tried to steady himself, but the knife buried in his ribs had stolen his strength. Diego stood over him, breathing hard but controlled. His knuckles ached from the fight. His body reminded him of his age, but his focus remained sharp. Behind him, Mateo checked the last of the fallen guards. Luis, still clutching a knife, looked pale and shaken, but alive. It should have been over. Then Ramon laughed, a low, wet chuckle full of something far more dangerous than fear. Satisfaction. Diego's eyes narrowed. "What's so funny?" Ramon grinned, his teeth stained red. "You think this ends with me?" He coughed again, forcing himself to sit up. His voice was weaker now, but the amusement never left. "I told you, Diego. You should have finished the job years ago." Diego's jaw clenched. Then he heard it, a distant rumble. Engines. Mateo cursed under his breath. "More are coming." Diego turned toward the open warehouse door. Down the road, headlights cut through the night, approaching fast. Ramon's reinforcements, at least 20 men, armed, ready. Luis's breath hitched. "We need to get out of here." But Diego didn't move. His eyes remained on Ramon, studying him. The wolf was dying, but he wasn't afraid, because he knew something Diego didn't. Diego took a step closer. "What are you hiding?" Ramon's grin widened. He leaned in, voice a whisper. "You never asked. Who sent me after you?" For the first time, Diego felt something cold settle in his chest. Then, Ramon lunged. Despite his wound, he moved with sudden speed, his hand snapping forward. A hidden blade, small but deadly, flashed toward Diego's throat. But Diego was faster. His instincts took over. He twisted, deflecting the strike, then drove his own knife into Ramon's heart. Ramon gasped, his eyes widening in shock. For a moment, he didn't move. Then his body sagged. Diego held him there, his face inches away. Ramon's lips twitched, not in fear but in understanding. "Too late," he murmured. Then he was gone. Diego let go, and Ramon's body slumped to the floor. Mateo exhaled sharply. One problem solved. But Diego wasn't listening. Ramon's final words echoed in his mind. "Who sent me after you?" Before he could think further, the roar of the approaching vehicles snapped him back to reality. Mateo reloaded his gun. "We need a way out now." Luis swallowed hard. "There's a back exit, but..." Gunfire erupted from outside. They were out of time. Diego turned to Mateo. "We make a stand here." Mateo gave a sharp nod. "Let's show them who they're dealing with." The final battle had begun. The first burst of gunfire shattered the windows, sending shards of glass scattering across the floor. The roar of engines cut through the night as Ramon's reinforcements arrived in full force. Diego moved quickly, flipping over a heavy desk for cover. Mateo took position by the doorway, gun steady. Luis scrambled to the far corner, his hands shaking as he clutched a pistol he barely knew how to use. The first wave of men stormed inside. Diego fired. Precise, unwavering. 2 men dropped instantly. Matteo took down a third before ducking behind cover as bullets riddled the walls. Luis hesitated, then squeezed the trigger. A wild shot. A miss. Diego grabbed him by the arm, pulling him down as another round of bullets tore through the room. "Stay low," Diego ordered. Luis nodded frantically, his breath ragged. Outside, more men were gathering. Too many. Matteo swore under his breath. "We won't last long like this." Diego scanned the room. They needed to shift the fight, control the battlefield. Then he saw it. The overhead scaffolding. Old, rusted, but high ground. "Up," Diego said. Matteo followed his gaze and nodded. "I'll cover you." Diego grabbed Luis and moved. They climbed the metal stairs as bullets ricocheted off the railing. Every step was a risk. They reached the top, just as another group of Ramon's men entered below. From here, Diego had the advantage. He took a breath, aimed, fired. 4 shots, 4 kills. Matteo joined him, laying down suppressing fire. The enemy scrambled, confused, not expecting the sudden shift, but it wasn't enough. More were coming. Then, an explosion rocked the building. The ground trembled. Dust rained from the ceiling. Diego's stomach dropped. Something was wrong. Matteo cursed. What the hell was that? Then they saw it. Fire. Ramon's men had set the building ablaze. The warehouse was old. Dry wood. Fuel containers stacked in the corner. The flames spread fast. Diego's mind raced. They had minutes. Below, the remaining gunmen started backing away. They had never planned on winning this fight. They planned on burying Diego inside. Matteo realized it too. "They're sealing us in." Luis's breath came in sharp gasps. "We're trapped." Diego didn't answer. His mind was already working. There was always a way out. His eyes locked on the rafters, a jump, a risk, but their only chance. He turned to Luis. "Do exactly as I say." Luis nodded, terror in his eyes. Diego moved first. He ran, full speed, and leaped. The old steel groaned under his weight, but it held. Matteo followed. A perfect landing. Luis hesitated, then ran. He jumped, but slipped. Diego lunged, catching his wrist just as he began to fall. The fire below raged. Heat licked at their boots. Diego held on. "Don't let go," he gritted out. Luis's fingers slipped. "No!" Matteo caught his other arm. Together they pulled. Luis scrambled up, breathless, eyes wide with panic. They weren't out yet. Smoke thickened, choking the air. The entire warehouse groaned as the fire consumed it. The roof. Diego spotted a skylight, their last escape. "We go up." Matteo didn't question it. They climbed the final structure, ignoring the heat, the sweat dripping into their eyes. Luis moved slower but pushed through. They reached the skylight. Diego smashed the glass with his elbow. Fresh air rushed in. The sky, freedom, was just beyond. One by one, they climbed onto the rooftop. Below, the warehouse collapsed. Diego watched it burn. Ramon was dead. His men scattered. San Rios was safe, but his mind was elsewhere. Ramon's last words haunted him. "You never asked who sent me." This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The fire burned long into the night. By dawn, the warehouse was nothing but smoldering ruins, ashes carried by the wind. The battle was over, but the cost was undeniable. Diego stood at the edge of town, watching as the people of San Rios emerged from their homes. They had survived. Ramon was dead. His men had either fled or surrendered. For now, the town was safe. But Diego knew better than to believe in peace. Matteo stepped beside him, wiping soot from his face. "So," he said, exhaling, "what now?" Diego didn't answer immediately. His mind was still replaying Ramon's last words. Someone had sent him, someone bigger. "I need to find out who," Diego finally said. Matteo nodded. "Figured you'd say that." He glanced back at Luis, who stood a few feet away, quiet, uncertain. "And the kid?" Diego studied Luis for a moment. He had seen fear in the boy's eyes, but he had also seen something else. A choice, a path not yet decided. "He stays," Diego said, "if he wants to." Luis straightened slightly, understanding what Diego was offering. A second chance. From across the street, Rosa met Diego's gaze. She gave a small nod, silent gratitude. The town had accepted him as one of their own. But Diego knew staying wasn't an option. The past wasn't done with him. As he turned away from the rising sun, one thought settled deep in his chest. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.